You're listening to the Born to Kick-Ass podcast with Matt Tomasi and can be found at borntokickass.com/episode 23.
Welcome to the Born to Kick-Ass podcast, where you're introduced to the most fascinating people on the planet. Learn the ingredients of greatness that you can apply to your life. And now your host, Matthew Tomasi.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook of your choice and a 30-day free trial by visiting borntokickass.com/audible. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. To download your free audiobook today, go to borntokickass.com/audible. Again, that's borntokickass.com/audible for your free audiobook. Do you know someone or know of someone who walks the walk and would like to hear them on the Born to Kick-Ass podcast? They can be from any field, but they need to have an inspiring story that will help to motivate others to achieve their own goals. If you do, please head over to borntokickass.com/suggest a guest and fill out the form. We'd love to hear from you. Dr. Kate Leeming is an explorer and adventurer and has cycled the equivalent of twice the distance around the world at the equator. To date, Kate's three main cycling expeditions include Breaking the Cycle in Africa, a 10-month, 22,040-kilometre journey across Africa from Senegal to Somalia in 2010, the Great Australian Cycle Expedition, a 25,000-kilometre journey around and through Australia, 7,000 kilometres of which were off-road on isolated tracks in remote regions in 2004, and also the Trans-Siberian Cycle Expedition, a 5-month, 13,400-kilometre bicycle journey from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok. In this interview, Kate talks about her recent 400-kilometre Breaking the Cycle in Greenland expedition, which was a training ride for her upcoming Breaking the Cycle South Pole expedition, where she is attempting to cycle 1,850 kilometres across Antarctica via the South Pole. Enjoy the interview. Kate Leeming, thanks for your time today and welcome to the Born to Kick-Ass podcast.
Pleasure, Matt. Good to be here.
Now, you've just come back from Ladakh in India.
That's right, yeah.
So what were you doing there?
Up in Ladakh, which is the very far north of India, and I was leading or escorting a trip for World Expeditions. So it was a group of 10 of us, and we did a 500k route through from Leh, which is the capital of Ladakh, down through to Manali, which is 5 mountain passes later. And, it was a pretty amazing trip, actually. But it was just like a little cameo trip, and lots of different sort of standards of cycling. But it was a great time had by all, actually.
So is Ladakh like a state of India, or is it like a country?
Yeah, it's actually Ladakh's kind of the peaceful eastern half of Kashmir. So it's also known as Little Tibet, and there's lots of Buddhist monasteries up there. The Dalai Lama has his summer residence, which we visited there. So it's very culturally different to anywhere else in India, and it's a very peaceful place, and lots of high mountains. The highest mountain passes pretty much in the world are there. We covered 4 out of the 5 passes we did were 5,000 metres or more. And so actually the hardest thing about the cycle was actually the lack of oxygen in the air. That was what made it really hard. The passes, yes, they were sort of hard, but we weren't doing kind of big distances, or certainly not what I'm used to. So it was really the altitude that made it sort of tough for me anyway. So
now you are a How would you describe yourself? An extreme cyclist or an adventurer?
Expedition cyclist.
Expedition cyclist.
Yeah, expedition cyclist sounds pretty good. Adventurer, explorer, all of those things.
I've read on your website, kateleeming.com, that you've ridden the equivalent of 2 times around the equator, like in terms of distance.
That's
times
right,
around
yeah.
the Earth.
So, yeah, it's about 80,000 kilometres worth, that is. That's on my major expeditions. So there's really 4 major efforts in that. The first was just me learning the ropes in Europe, just travelling for myself through Europe, where I did about 15,000 kilometres in total. And that was just a personal discovery. And then the first really serious expedition I did was called the Trans-Siberian Cycle Expedition, which was 13,500 kilometres from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok back in 1993. And that was aiding the children affected by the Chernobyl disaster as well. So that was kind of the first time I really got together. You know, I found a cycling mate, had some Russians that did different sections with us as well. The first time I had to find sponsorship, do a little bit of PR, and it was all a learning curve, really. And actually, that's the one person who really changed that for me was a guy called Robert Swan, who's a polar explorer and the first person to have walked both the North and South Poles. And when I was organising that trip, I met Robert, and Robert kind of really inspired me and sort of helped me gain a lot of confidence and understand the value out of what I was doing. So rather than just cycling for me, as I had done through Europe, which was still important, but this time there was more value out of it. So that's where I kind of took a step up as such, and that worked really well. I got the team, Greg Yeoman, a British cyclist, and myself, reached Vladivostok 1 day ahead of schedule after 5 months and beat the Russian winter. We had to do it in summer. So that was an amazing time, and it was when Russia was really changing, you know. So it only just become possible to travel across the whole of the country because it just come out of communism, so it became the CIS, and then finally into the independent countries. So previously, before that, there were certain parts of the country that were closed. So we got permission to actually cover the whole country. So it's kind of, we saw a country changing before our eyes, which was pretty amazing. Still is when I think about it.
Did you drink much vodka on that particular expedition?
Oh, tried not to, because what ended up happening, you know, we're covering, you know, we usually cover, you know, 130, 140, 150 Ks pretty often, or, you know, they're pretty full days. And the people were always almost overwhelmingly friendly just about all the way through. And sometimes if you stay in people's houses, that get this sort of rocket fuel out, which is like the roughest vodka you could possibly imagine, and sort of throw the cap away, and you kind of had to share it with them, the whole bottle, and it wasn't really good for the liver when you're also eating copious quantities of fatty food and then having to cycle distances. So a couple of times, yeah, we did, and certainly Greg is probably more Australian than me. And a couple of times we even had the whole horrible moonshine, which is just basically homemade spirit. And they put in a few drops of water, which is like virtually 100% alcohol, you know. Yeah.
You would have felt that, you know, if you're sort of somewhat dehydrated, you know, the alcohol would have sucked out that extra moisture from your body. But can you maybe give us a background on yourself, where you grew up, and how did you actually get into cycling? Were you active growing up at all?
Very active growing up, but not necessarily cycling. Yes, I did have a bike when I was young. In fact, because I grew up on a wheat farm in Western Australia, about 130 kilometres northeast of Perth. Quite isolated because our nearest neighbour was about 5 kilometres away. So we used to, do a lot of things on the farm. It was a pretty good lifestyle when I go back to it. And so I used to sometimes earn pocket money. One of the ways was to go and collect cow manure, and fill up a ute load of cow manure, which my parents would advertise in the newspaper, and certain people in town wanted to buy this cow manure. So I used to get $7 for loading the ute with cow manure and selling that. So my first bicycle, which was like a second-hand sort of drag 70s flower power second-hand bike, and it cost me 4 units of manure. So that was how I earned my first bike, apart from the little three-wheelers and things like that when we were little toddlers. I didn't really cycle much. I was an all-round sports person, very much so. In primary school and then secondary school, I was sort of state level at 4 different sports, and either representative or just in the squads. So those squads being squash, hockey, athletics, and cricket. I was also a pretty handy tennis player and a few other things as well. So all my time was just spent doing all of that, and cycling wasn't really in the school system. We called a bus to school. In primary school, that I went away to boarding school, of which I lived on site, so in Perth. So I didn't really cycle at all until I left school, and I was at uni and used to cycle around. Got a decent sort of road bike, my first decent road bike, and I started doing little trips. Just cycling for fitness, really, thinking about maybe getting into triathlons. Except I'm not a very good swimmer, but I was playing hockey and squash at a very high standard, so I didn't really have time. But anyway, I love cycling and always dreamed of potentially, travelling to Europe and cycling in Italy or France. I thought that would be my dream. That would be awesome. And then back in 1990, I know it's a long time ago now, but a group of us organised a University of Western Australia hockey tour of the UK, and 30 of us, sort of a men's and a women's team, went over, and 6 came back, and everyone else stayed over travelling. And that's when I, with a little group of friends, picked up a bike and organised firstly a little trip in Ireland with one guy, just some hire bikes, and then into France. I organised a more major trip through France. And that was the start of it, really, and that's where I really started to explore Europe and sort of discovered my passion for travelling by bike. And I guess the main reasons why I like to travel by bike, it gives this incredible connection with the people and the land. And, I really love the idea of bringing a line on a map to life. And it really gives a great sense of place, a realistic perspective of how the world fits together. And I think that's really what I'm doing, even with the expeditions as well. I'm kind of getting this close, intimate relationship with the places that I travel through. And on a bike, you can do a little bit more distance than you can walking. But still, it's a really great, I can still sort of use all my skills as a sports person as well. And I get a little bit competitive within myself, but try not to. I've never competed on a bike, and I don't really want to. I'll leave it for what I'm doing now. So, and of course you can eat a lot, and you can, you just meet all sorts of people, and I can remember, all of my photographs that I've ever taken, pretty much, that I've taken when I'm traveling by bike, because it just means so much. You planned it, you experience it, and the memories forever, really.
So, when you were cycling around Europe, was it just? Did you have like a set itinerary, or was it just you just started to explore?
No, I'm a planner, and I kind of got a couple of really good books with good information, and I went along to the Cycle Tourist Club of Great Britain, or the UK, I think it is, and because this is before computers really, and so I got all these sheets about the different countries, and I kind of made a plan and ticked things that I really wanted to see and join the dots, and pretty much kept to it. And I've kind of planned things in a similar way ever since, in terms of I've kind of work out what I want to see. I'm trying to create a story and create a sort of perspective for me initially, and then for others as well later with what I've been doing. And so my plans are always adaptable, but I've always managed to stick to that bit of that schedule, because then I kind of get everything done that I want to see as well. And sometimes it means I might sort of go more slowly in one place and faster in other places, or cut a little bit off, extra bit off that I plan, because I always plan for the maximum, with the idea that I might not be able to do it all. But I mean, even with Europe, I had to get back the main trip, which was a 9,000 kilometre trip through there. I had to get back to the UK at a certain time, and I did. So kind of, was from the Spain through to Turkey and back through Central Europe, and I arrived back when I was meant to. So I've kind of, that set the pattern for everything else that I've done, because they've all finished sort of on time and budget, and touch wood, no major injuries, and generally all the missions achieved. So yeah, it kind of started with Europe, and that was just, there was no expectations from anyone else except me. So I guess I set certain standards of things that I want to do and achieve, and then work towards those. Otherwise, I couldn't do it without any plans at all.
Yeah. So after Europe, or I'm guessing during that European cycle, when was that? 1990.
91 was the main one, and then I did another trip in 92 up through Norway, up to the Nordkapp, so in Bergen up to the Nordkapp, which was one of my favourite little trips. Just loved Norway. It's awesome, yeah. And
then you moved on to so when you're during these the early days of sort of the longer distance expeditions that you were doing, sort of really getting your dipping your feet in the water type thing. Did you then start to really toy with the idea of doing something massive? Like you mentioned the Trans-Siberian expedition, which is 13,400 kilometres. Were you sort of toying with those ideas early days? Like, oh, geez, I wouldn't mind doing something like massive.
Yes. I mean, initially I didn't have any idea of what could be achieved on a bike. So I guess Europe really just opened my eyes up as to what I could really do, and that I could comfortably, travel 130 k's a day and repeat that. That seemed to be about my standard. But, I was always intrigued about Russia and the former Soviet Union, because it was a place we could never really go to, especially Siberia. And most people relate to Siberia as being a place of, a frozen wasteland with salt mines and flat lands, and it's the sort of biggest country in the world, Russia, and it's just sitting there in the world map when I was a kid, looking at that, wondering what the hell's, what's there. So there was an intrigue about that, but I didn't really understand what I could have done on a bike. But then, obviously, after Europe, I sort of started to get that idea. And originally, I think I was planning to cycle home to Australia. And then I started looking about Russia, and then I met Robert Swan as well, and he was saying, well, why don't you do something really good for this new country, for Russia? And so I chose to aid children affected by the Chernobyl disaster, and that was, something I wouldn't have considered, 7 years before when Chernobyl actually happened, because, I was on the other side of the world at university, and I was really glad that I was on the other side of the world with that sort of Europe being contaminated with radiation. But suddenly things had changed. I was starting to see the world a bit differently, and I could actually do something about it. And so that's how it kind of, these things started to come together. So I was relating, and from that point on, I've always tried to support the people and places that I travel to. So that was the first one that I did there. So that got molded into a journey from sort of the most westerly city in St. Petersburg to Vladivostok, so, and in a continuous line, with a diversion, a 1,200 diversion down around the Sayan Mountains, which are just above northwestern Mongolia.
Yeah. Oh, that would have been good.
Really fascinating. Yeah, it was one of the most fascinating parts of the whole trip, actually. It was just culturally, we were meeting new cultures. The Hakkas people and the Tuvan people had their own languages. The Tuvans are pretty much like Mongolians, and they're Buddhist as well, and yak herders and so on, and totally different. The Hakkas speak their own language, which is its own script even, and it's a mixture of Turkish and Russian and something else. And these people weren't allowed to practice their cultures for the previous 70 years, so suddenly they were sort of free to do that. And so it was kind of a very interesting time to be there and see some of these things.
It would have been like stepping back in time, hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
Like, they wouldn't have had Facebook and mobile phones and TVs pretty much, was it?
Yeah, no, and it was, the Hakkas people, they're shaman as well, so that they're totally different. And they look a little bit more like, say, American Indians in terms of facial features. So And then there were the Buryats as well, which are kind of more similar, and they're again shaman and yeah. So it was really amazing to see that, and just to see Siberia for what it really is, and it's not a frozen wasteland at all. And once you get over the Urals, then you enter Siberia, and that was the first month. And then, from Ekaterinburg through Omsk and Novosibirsk, which looks huge on the map, we did that in 2 weeks, even if it was into the wind. And the rest of it was not flat at all. It was generally rolling hills and mountains. And after Lake Baikal, which was above sort of central Ulaanbaatar, maybe, it's just sort of above there. And that's the largest freshwater lake in the world, and that's an incredible place. A lot of people know about that these days. But after that, then we hit pretty much the swamp, which is like 1,500 kilometers, where there were no roads marked on our maps. We had US air military maps, which that was all we could get, and even they weren't correct. So we basically followed the railway line, which was our lifeline through the swamp, and often we could walk, travel along the little winter tracks along the side, little maintenance tracks, but then there were no bridges there, and we had to drag our bikes up onto the railway line to sort of go over the bridges. And anywhere where the roads just disappeared underwater, it was back pushing along the railway line. So we always kept close to the railway line, or pretty much. Sometimes there were forestry or mining tracks we tried to follow, but they weren't marked on our maps. And locals often didn't really travel very far, so they couldn't often give us much in the way of directions. And there were certainly no road signs, so we got lost a couple of times, which we had to backtrack.
So how did you deal with the language barrier? Could you speak Russian at all, or sort of the local language where you were?
No, not really. We tried a bit, but the whole expedition was organised within 4 months from when I started organising it. So there wasn't really time to learn anything much. But my plan was always to have at least one Russian with us. And so we had 5 different Russians who did different parts of the journey. A couple of them didn't actually really speak English at all, but they still helped us with things like changing money, helped keep us safe, helped if they heard that there were bandits around, we didn't go there, kind of thing. So it really worked well. It was a bit frustrating that we couldn't communicate with certainly the first guy very well, and he wasn't a particularly strong cyclist. So Greg and I were sometimes he sort of put his bike on a vehicle or something. But it still helped with shopping as well, and it was a pretty good plan, actually.
10 years. So that took about 5 months, was it? 13,400
kilometers?
Yeah. About 5 months?
Yeah.
So if you fast forward sort of 10 years post that expedition, you did the Great Australian Cycle Expedition, GRACE.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
So I was based in the UK. So after Russia, I was still based in the UK for all of that time. And then I really, really wanted to see how my own country fit into the rest of the world. And so when I came back here and got a job back here in Australia, I kind of started working there, but I really I had already started planning the Great Australian Cycle Expedition. And it really was it was partly a personal exploration of Australia, because I come from the southwest corner. And yes, I've been a little bit up to the Pilbara region, and I've been to most capital cities just to play sport, but I just didn't know my own country. So that's how it sort of started. But then this was a time when the concept of sustainability was really taking hold as well. And I'm really particularly interested in land use and how the land is used, just because of my background of growing up in a wheat and sheep farm and understanding how we used to work the land and get the most out of the land and look after the land. So that was particularly interesting to me. And then I approached UNESCO, and it became one of the first demonstration activities for their Decade of Education for Sustainable Development. So during this journey, I was popping in at remote locations and schools, and I was reporting about what I saw, and I had my own website for the first time, and so all those things I was learning what to do there, and it was actually a 25,000 k journey. So if you went around the edge of Australia, that's about 14,000 kilometres, to give you an idea. There's actually 7,000 kilometres off-road on remote tracks, such as the Cape York Peninsula Development Road, the Gulf Track, the Tanami Track, the Great Central Road and Gunbarrel Highway, and then the Canning Stock Route, which that was kind of the hardest bit and the highlight of the whole journey probably as well. So the Canning Stock Route, for those who don't know, starts in the middle of Western Australia, a town called Wiluna, and travels up to the Kimberley, 1,800 kilometres, crosses 4 deserts, almost 1,000 sand dunes. That bit I did actually do supported because I was on my own, and there isn't very much water there, and the only place you can get any kind of food is like 1,000 kilometres up. So I just had a regular mountain bike, so I didn't. Anyone who's done it since me used a fat bike, which changes the game a little bit. It was particularly hot. It was like 40 degrees or more every single day, and it was really important to me to do this trip because I have a great uncle, William Snell, and he reconditioned 2/3 of that stock route in 1929. So I was kind of following what he was doing and some of the wells that he renovated and little marks that he'd made. And I had his journal, or a copy of his journal, I should say, notes with me. So I was sort of following that. So that was spiritually a really sort of important part of that journey. And actually, William Snell, the same guy, in 1897, when he was 25, he cycled from Menzies in the West Australian goldfields. It's about 230 k's north of Kalgoorlie, across to Melbourne to propose to his childhood sweetheart. So then she said yes. And they were married, and he put her on a boat bound for Fremantle. And then he cycled all the way back again. So this story is, I heard about when I was growing up, and from my grandmother. So it was kind of. It was really important for me to sort of follow and see a couple of things that he'd done. So
I'm just looking at some of the photos of the Canning Stock Route just on Google. How much water were you drinking per day, like on average?
It
would have been
probably 7 litres.
Yep. And was there
something like that?
Was there? Are there any other cars going down, either passing you in either direction, or do you just go for days without seeing anyone?
Well, I did have a support vehicle, but other than that, we saw 8 cars. We saw 8 cars in a month. So this was at the end of the season. The reason being, the whole timing of this whole expedition, it had to work in with the seasons because I had started and finished in Canberra. Then I had to go kind of all the way up to the tip of Cape York, so that couldn't be any earlier. So I started on the 10th of May, I think it was. So to make the timing work to get up there, you had to have dried out enough to do that, and then to do all of the rest of my route, then it meant that I started the Canning Stock Route later than it would be ideal. If I was just doing the stock route on its own, then I would have started obviously much earlier in the season. So it was just getting into becoming humid and extra hot. And by the time I got towards the top, there were thunderstorms every night. And I altered my route slightly after the stock route. I was going to go on the Gibb River Road, but I didn't do all of it because it was just too dangerous. It could have got cut off, and probably did get cut off, I think, because it was getting late October and into November. So it was there's something like 52 wells, I think it is, every roughly 30 kilometres, give or take, but a lot of them, as I say, didn't have potable water. It's changed a bit now. More of them have been renovated, and there's a lot of traffic during the winter. So during, say, July, that kind of time, July, August, there's kind of quite a lot more traffic. So that cuts the road up, and it's not a road, it's a track. So it's not graded or anything or built. So it's just corrugations, soft corrugations all the time, just about, made it tough.
Did you go through any Aboriginal settlements at all? You know, either in the Northern Territory or WA?
Oh, yeah, lots of times in overall. Yeah, it's kind of quite a shock quite often and a learning process. You know, I stayed in a couple of them, like Ladjumanu I stayed in, which is, how do I explain? It's in the Northern Territory. You come off the main road heading down through Victoria River Downs Station towards, and then down the Subbuljack Road. So it's pretty isolated, and I know I find it quite depressing actually to go into them just because of the state that they're in, and quite often, you know, alcohol's been banned in those communities, but it's just really sort of, there's a lot of work to do, shall I say, putting it nicely. And you can walk into the community store and it's just full of junk food, and Aboriginal people eating this terrible junk food. You know, where diabetes and obesity and things are not good. But actually away from the communities and out on the road, anytime I saw or crossed paths with Aboriginal people, they were so friendly, and they'd always stop just to see if we were okay, because they could really relate probably to what I was doing. And they would always stop and we'd have a little chat, and they were just seeing if you're okay, which is just, you know, very nice to, you know, it was wonderful actually. So it sort of really bonded in many ways, but I found a lot of the communities, like Yuendamu, I stayed in Yuendamu as well. That was a mess. And just trying to get to learn a little bit about what's going on. And we'd have to stay in the visitors' quarters, which, you know, and all around was just mess, really. So
that was about 25,000 kilometres. How long did that take roughly?
It's about 9.5 months. So, so started and finished in Canberra. And what was actually quite cool was, you know, having ridden like 17,500 kilometres and then riding in through the back gate of my home farm, you know, and just connect all of this part of Australia up. I'd been, you know, right through northern and central Australia, and just connecting all that up to where I come from and my childhood, and then moving on again, and then, you know, finishing the journey around Tasmania and then back up to Canberra. You know, it was a really great way to get to know my country a little bit better and put it in a perspective of how it fits together. So it was an excellent trip.
And then in 2010 you did Breaking the Cycle in Africa. So
that's right.
Did a 10-month, 22,040 kilometre journey. Whereabouts did you start? Was it on the West Coast?
Yeah, that's right. So the journey was from Africa's most westerly tip in Senegal, just west of Dakar, to Cape Harpoon in Puntland in Somalia. So it was through 20 different countries in a continuous line. I did not break the line of my journey, didn't miss a kilometre. And you can imagine this was a pretty, it was an incredible journey, but it was also, you know, quite difficult to put together to make sure it worked. So, and this time I was exploring the causes and effects of extreme poverty. So you hear all these things about Africa, and certainly growing up, you know, most of the information you get is generally pretty negative, and you only get little sort of pockets of information, whereas Africa as a continent is the most diverse continent on Earth, second largest continent, and I knew there was much more to it. And I guess, you know, the media especially portray it as a difficult and dangerous place, so there's a lot of fear involved about when people that's associated with Africa. And so I probably, you know, growing up wouldn't have imagined that I could cycle across it. But actually, after all the other experiences, it seemed like I really wanted to explore Africa as well. And, you know, other people cycle north to south, especially, you know, Cape Town to Cairo is a pretty usual route these days. Fewer people cycle down the west side. But but no one's actually ever cycled in a continuous line from the most westerly tip to the most easterly tip. People have cycled across in different ways, but not from one to the other without breaking the line. So that was a little extra challenge in there. And so, when I design all of my journeys, and especially as I'm getting, things are becoming a bit more intricate. And so this time, I really want to explore the causes and effects of extreme poverty, but I can't just do that by cycling through. So what I did is that I created 10 different expedition partners that were different sorts of various initiatives and organisations. And the idea was to create this story where I was arriving at places, visiting projects, and learning much more deeply about the various issues that are relate to poverty. So I was trying to get a much deeper understanding. So it was the cycling, plus there were 15 different projects actually that I visited during that journey. So it was kind of trying to create a different context so that people could have a better understanding about Africa. So that's kind of what I was trying to do.
So how long did it take to plan for this African expedition?
Well, it was an idea for quite a long time, but when I actually had the guts to start moving on it, it took about 18 months to put together. So this time I really wanted to film it. I never filmed it or got other people to film it, but I knew that this was going to be important because I couldn't, film my interactions very easily. Wouldn't really work. So to film it, then I had to have a support vehicle, and then I had to find the people to be able to do that. And I didn't have a huge budget. I had to generate what ended up being worth about $200,000 budget. So I had to find the sponsorship, put all that together, find the partners, find a team, people that I could trust. I had 7 different people in that team at different times. I found a support vehicle driver, a Scottish guy who one of my friends knew and introduced us. But I hadn't actually met because he was in Scotland. Another of the starting team members was in the UK. So I hadn't actually met them face-to-face till 2 weeks before I sort of went down to Africa. So it's kind of like there were so many things to pull together. It nearly killed me just before it started, because it's to get the security issues right, to get the whole logistics right. One of my strategies was also to approach various Australian junior mining companies that had interest in Africa. And the reason being that they'd always have really good relations with the government. They'd have their own Mr. Fix-It people that have bases in the country where they worked. And if there were any issues, like we're having trouble with visas, they could usually have people who could fix that up as well. So that kind of worked really well because I had 11 different partners in that situation. And I chose some of these companies that were based in places where I certainly was going to probably need some help, i.e. Puntland in Somalia, in the Republic of Congo, in Cameroon, which was just in the centre of my journey, and at the start in Senegal, and then a few others spread through the whole way. So it kind of really allowed for smooth running of the journey, and we could even have things sent in advance, or if we needed to send footage back, we could do that through these safer places. So it kind of helped it work really, so it ran pretty as smoothly as our journey could run in Africa.
Is there any sort of dangerous moments that you experienced in any of the countries while you're cycling across Africa?
Oh, I guess, there are. I mean, I never felt in fear of my life, but at the same time, there was a shooting incident in the Republic of Congo where it was exactly my 10,000th kilometre. And it was just me, this part of the region, which was just to the west of Brazzaville, the capital. It's called the Pool region, which is where there had been absolutely serious civil war, and just the remnants of that civil war were still there, and the ninja rebels. And the government insisted on giving us an armed escort through this area, and plus we had a plainclothes inspector in our car and 2 more sort of soldiers in the vehicle behind. So we had a ute in front with 7 soldiers on the back with AK-47s and rocket launchers, and then had me on a bike, and then the Land Rover Defender behind with those people that I mentioned and my teammates all squashed in. And I was just checking my 10,000th kilometre, and suddenly there was a couple of shots out of the jungle. And I sort of jumped, obviously, and just froze briefly. And then the couple of the soldiers jumped off the back of the ute in front and chased after the rebels, fired a couple of shots back, and then the commander just waved me through and said, "Come on, cycle past." So I was like, "Oh, yeah, whatever." So, and it was kind of muddy and sandy, a bit of mix of mud and sand and water. So, needless to say, I finished that section sort of with a bit of extra speed. So they were never shooting at me. They were actually shooting at the soldiers, because the soldiers were preventing them from collecting a tax from us, i.e. some money from us, because that's kind of how they survived. So I was never really under threat, but it was a shock. And then there are a few other sort of bits and pieces, but I guess the main thing was getting through Somaliland and then Puntland in Somalia. So you've got to think of Somalia as three different states. You've got southern Somalia, which is where Mogadishu is, and where certainly is totally overrun by Al-Shabaab, or virtually at the time. And then you have Somaliland, which was formerly British Somalia, which is in the north and northwest, and sort of in that corner with Ethiopia. And that's the most stable territory, and it kind of actually has its own elections. It wants to secede from the rest of Somalia, and it's kind of really trying very hard economically to get its feet off the ground, but it's still considered by the UN as part of Somalia, so they're kind of quite stuck. But there's a lot of very proud people there. So we had my support vehicle didn't come into Somalia. We had two different plans for Somaliland and Puntland, and the first one was with a government minister, or he's actually in opposition, and he was running an incredible NGO himself. And so this fellow called Omar, and he organised two vehicles, one with security, two security guards that were watching us 24/7, and then his own vehicle for my cameraman, just my cameraman and myself. Obviously, I was cycling. And so that was how we travelled through Somaliland. And as we approached Puntland, things started hotting up, because there's actually Puntland and Somaliland don't actually get on very well. It's a disputed buffer zone of about 130 k's, of which is lawless in parts of it, in most of it. So there was a kind of a major thing to organise by the Puntland government to get us across. There was only one day that we could get across, and there were soldiers sent through to escort us through, and there was a bit of argy-bargy and that kind of thing. I just sort of stood my ground quietly. And then in Puntland, we were the guests of the whole Puntland government, which is like a state government. So it's like a state of Victoria or Western Australia or Queensland or whatever. And they just formed in 1997 just to have some sort of governance over their country, because there'd been nothing for 20 years, and it's just... most of these people were diaspora. So several of them were Australian Somalis who had chosen to go back to make a difference. And that's why I really trusted them. And they were just brilliant. They put themselves on the line 24/7 every day. And there was a conflict that just started with Al-Shabaab 3 days before I entered the country, because they were setting up training camps in Puntland, and the government wanted to get them before they got too powerful. So this is the context of me entering Puntland. And so everywhere in Puntland, we're accompanied by two bulletproof vehicles with government ministers in, and a full technical unit, which is a military unit with 11 soldiers. That's 8 soldiers in the back, and a gunner and a commander and a driver. So it's not something as you know it.
Yeah, full on.
But they trusted me. I trusted them. I got to meet the president in Garowe, which is the capital, just after crossing the buffer zone. I was their guest, and it was touch and go whether I was going to get permission to cross all the way to Cape Hafun, because we had to go quite close to the conflict zone. So it kind of had to be done undercover. We weren't even allowed to make any phone calls or send any emails, because it could all be picked up. And basically, first couple of days was up the main road to Bosaso. to a place called Cardo. And then after that, the last 400 Ks, just under 400 Ks, was cross country through the Somali plains. And yeah, it was quite an experience. And I was kind of feeling this mix of being absolutely elated. You know, how lucky am I to be able to do this? It was kind of it was surreal. Can you imagine it? You're sort of going across these, a bit like the Nullarbor. That's kind of what the plane's like. You sort of go across there. You've got these soldiers, and they're exhausted because they've been at battle. They come to join us. They're being with us because it was less of a threat than being shot at. Although we have to avoid insurgents at one point. They told me that, but they did. Didn't tell until after this. So, you know, and then to finally come through to Cape, and the history there is you know, it goes back to ancient times where they used to trade spices and travel other parts of the world from the east, and it's all mixed up. There's even a necropolis under Cape Hafun, the village of Hafun. There's Italian invasion and salt mines and things there, and then, you know, the final climb up onto Ras Hafun, which is like a tabletop mountain, sort of a couple of 100 meters up, and it's the bleakest place you could possibly imagine, almost. And finally, to get to the lighthouse was pretty cool.
Now, when you come to the end of these expeditions, do you get like a feeling of, like, obviously you'd be elated, you know, getting to the end of it, but do you also ever get a feeling of you've come down from the high and it's like, oh, now what? Do you ever sort of feel that way at all? Like, you know, you've finished the end of the African expedition, and then it's like, okay, I've come to the end of the road. And do you ever have that feeling of sort of weighing up what your options are next? You know, what's sort of next? What are you going to sort of plan for next? Do you ever get that feeling?
Yeah, well, especially now as I become more ambitious with what I do, the end of the journey isn't the end of the project, because to come back, I had to therefore, you know, deal with press and trying to put into words what I've just been through, and try, you know, because that's part of my mission really, is to help open people's minds and to understand, to share with them how the world fits together, and also, you know, I had a plan to write a book, so that's my second book. So to get my head around that, we also had 110 hours worth of footage for me to start going through and to unlock the story. So it took a long time to really go through all of that and try and get this story into sort of a perspective that I could really, therefore, put it into a form that other people can understand. So that was actually a 4-year effort after I finished. By the time that so it's not like you've got 18 months to organise this thing, 10 months to do it, and then 4 years before the feature documentary came out. It was finished. Because I had to struggle with that, because I had a company in Melbourne that it just wasn't working with them. And by the time I found a path for it, I ended up working with an Irish filmmaker, an independent Irish filmmaker. You know, it's like so we got a film out. It won some awards in LA, but we haven't used it commercially yet. We're just finishing now, still 6 years after. A TV series, a 10 times 24-minute TV series that should be finished in September. And I did the voiceovers on the way back from Greenland a couple of months ago. So, you know, it's kind of like it's not just the expedition. I feel it's a real duty for me to be able to really make the most of these stories. It doesn't always pay off financially, but I wouldn't change it for anything else, you know. So you don't just have to be a good cyclist and a good planner. You know, I have to learn to be a presenter. I have to learn I'm learning a lot about filmmaking right now, and I've learned to write and to produce, and what it takes to get a book published is just, it's another struggle. So
all these things that you're juggling, you know, you've got the physical, you know, the actual expedition, you've got the planning leading up to the expedition, and then you've got all the post activities after the expedition, and you know, you've written 2 books. You know, you got the documentary and the film coming out. there's so many things that you're juggling and learning about. How do you sort of manage your time? Do you have a particular? How do you sort of manage that?
Yeah, well, it's not easy. I'm just blazing away here, sitting down a bit too much sometimes. But I do love the end product. If I've, say, for example, with the book, if I spend all that time designing the book and writing it and writing the story, and it's a bit of blood, sweat, and tears there, that's for sure. And my books are quite elaborate because it's how I like to tell the story. So they have usually, both books have 300 to 400 images within the text. So it's quite a thing to design, but that's how I want to tell the story. And a normal publisher doesn't really want to publish a book so elaborate, especially these days. So I've had to find another path and find more funding to be able to publish these books. So it's kind of like I feel like I'm getting a lot better at these things. To be able to present was something that was very difficult for me at the start, but now I don't stress so much about it. And again, writing, I've always been quite good at English, but to write a whole book is a whole different thing, and it's you know the story, but to actually get it down in words, in a process, in a manner that people can understand, and to be able to, sometimes I'm too close to it, I can't really edit that well, so I have to help us for that kind of thing. So I do enjoy it because I enjoy the finished product, and by the end of it, I'm really proud of it because it also gives me a bit of closure because I've had to think about it so hard and research a lot more and put all those things that I've seen into perspective. So it makes me helps me to understand at a deeper level personally as well as for other people as well.
Now, the name of this book, Njinga, is that how you pronounce it? Njinga?
You've done really well. You're the first people to get it right.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. It means bicycle in a Zambian language, and it comes up in the story. It's a really cool story. It's a great story in the film as well. We've got great footage of this, but it's a woman I was visiting who had AIDS, and I sit down with her. I get introduced to her, and I sit down with her. I didn't actually really know how sick she'd been or anything. And the interpreter explains to her that I've just cycled so far all the way from Senegal, and I was in Zambia, 14,000 kilometres, and you should see her face. The eyes pop out of her face. It was amazing. It's just really expressive and a really strong woman. And Njinga is what she was saying because it was this word for bicycle in her language. And so by complete fluke, it also happens to be the name of a 16th century Angolan queen who repelled the Portuguese colonists for like 40 years. But that's just a fluke that it is that, but I like to say that as well. So it's called Njinga. Yeah.
With these expeditions, they're many, many months long and tens of thousands of kilometres in terms of distance. With the low points in particular, how do you have any particular ways to deal with those low points? You might be slogging away in a particularly hot part of a certain country, and you're super dehydrated, and you got no energy. How do you sort of deal with those low points?
Yeah, it's something that you always, I guess I've got better and better and better at. But I think number one is that if you have if you're really sure about the mission of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and you've worked so hard to plan it, and I've got in Africa, in the case of Africa, 30 different sponsors behind me. I've got school kids following this expedition. I've got lots of people who trust and support and really want this to happen. And so you think, well, can I really keep going? Yes, I can. I can still turn the pedals. I just got to change. I don't have to go so fast today or whatever it is. And I have all sorts of mental techniques of passing the time and getting through this sort of thing. So often it's a lot of other adventurers might think the same way of sort of compartmentalizing the journey and breaking it down from, I would think of how amazing it's going to be to get, to the finish in Somalia. For me, in Africa and just about everywhere else, it's kind of after the excitement of the start, and it's sort of maybe a quarter of the way through. Like in Africa, I'd done 5,500 kilometres, but I still had 17,000 to go, and I was pushing into the Harmattan, which are seasonal trade winds that whip up sand and dust straight off the Sahara. I'd just had my third gastro. I had a chest infection. I was feeling pretty low, and this wind was relentless, and the sand, and so, what do you think about? Well, I was thinking about, the finish first and how amazing it was going to be, what I still had to achieve, what I still had to look forward to, and then I worked back, what was ahead of me in this month or this country, and then right back to each week, each day, each session, each hour, right back to, getting to the top of the next hill or getting to the next bush on the side of the road, as simple as that, or missing the next pothole. And I guess really what happened, sometimes, occasionally, especially there, sometimes I actually even stop just briefly and just make myself take a photograph, because if I do that, you're really forced to make a close study of the environment, and someone who's driving fast in a car past wouldn't notice all these things, but here you stop, take a photograph. It really forces me to have a look and really consciously look for the beauty in my surroundings, and I think that's the absolute crux of it. Every single time, if I go back to look at something and look for the beauty in your surroundings, it changes just about everything. And you choose to be there, so I'm choosing to be there, and it's a bit of discomfort for a day or two, but then that's where you've got to put it in perspective of the whole journey. It's not forever, and you're constantly learning and changing and learning new things. So I think that's cool. I mean, other stuff I do is like, trying to balance on the white lines on the road, or have biscuits or sweets in my bar bag where I can just pull one out every 5 kilometres, or, just little things like that to break it up as well.
Just with the tyres, how many flat tyres have you had? Like just countless?
Are you talking about which expedition?
I'm guessing you'd be an expert at...
Yeah, you'd be surprised. I generally don't have too many bad times. The Canning stock route was probably the worst. I had about 25 punctures. The reason being that the tyres were a softer compound that didn't have enough protection around them, and so little tiny sticks and thorns could get through. In Africa, through the Sahara, it was a similar issue. However, I had better tyres. I had tyres for the sort of tarmac and better road, and tyres for the off-road. But the tyres for the off-road had more gaps in them, which gave better flotation on the sand, but that also laid them open to punctures. And the first 3,000 kilometres, I had a young British guy cycling with me, but then he damaged his knee, and he seemed to somehow attract 4 times as many punctures as me. So I think I had about 7 and he had about 28. We were running out of patches, we were cutting up old tubes and just about running out of glue at one point. So punctures, yeah. My first trip through, or that 9,000 trip through Europe, I had a couple of punctures in Spain at the start and didn't have anything more for 8,000 Ks. I mean, and mostly everywhere else, I don't, touch wood, I haven't had too many punctures. It's not the biggest worry. It's just annoying. Yeah.
You've recently come back from Greenland. You did the Breaking the Cycle in Greenland, a 400K. Was this a training?
Yeah.
Training expedition or training session, I guess?
Yeah. So the next plan, which I've been working on for 3 years or so now, is called Breaking the Cycle South Pole, where I'm planning to cycle across the Antarctic continent via the South Pole. And the difference between this expedition and all the others is that it's obviously a polar environment, and I'm no expert in polar environments. So therefore I've got a whole series of training sessions scheduled and lots of equipment development because this is totally innovative and we're breaking new ground here. So no one's cycled across Antarctica via the South Pole before. 3 people have cycled to the South Pole. So this is just a longer trip, really, and about 1,800 kilometres, which is a sprint compared to everything else that I've done. But it's also going to be physically very intensive. And so I need to get the purpose of Greenland, other than being an awesome place, was to get my skills up and to test the second version of my polar bike. So coming back slightly, 3 years ago, I went to Spitsbergen with a team.
Where's that?
Spitsbergen are Norwegian islands well to the north of Norway. So they're about level with the top of Greenland, but above Norway. So they're around about 80 degrees north. And so it's polar conditions and quite easy to get there in terms of you can fly from Norway up there to Longyearbyen. And so that was the first test. And I had, this is, I said, quite different to the other things that I've done, but a new challenge. So I went up there with Australia's best known polar explorer, Eric Phillips, who's as guide, and we were learning from him. And then we had Claudio von Planta as the filmmaker. Claudio is a Swiss filmmaker, very well known for his work with Ewan McGregor and Charlie Borman on their motorbike journeys, Long Way Round and Long Way Down. And also another British remote locations filmmaker and photographer, Phil Coates. And the four of us got on like a house on fire up there, actually. But the other very interesting thing was that I was trying to work out with the bike, what's the best kind of bike that I could develop or use for polar conditions. And I went to North America because they tend to, have to cycle in snow and extreme cold. So I thought they'd be better experts in those conditions for cycling. And to cut a very, very long story short, I ended up connecting with a fellow called Steve Christini, who's based in Philadelphia, but in the late 90s and early 2000s, he'd created a normal mountain bike that was two-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. So it had an internal shaft drive system that you could drive. So from the rear hub on the opposite side to the drivetrain, there's a sort of a screw worm cog that drives a shaft that runs directly to the head tube at the front, crosses over, turns a rod that drives the front wheel with another cog. So it sounds very complex. It's an incredible piece of engineering. But Steve had only ever made these like just normal mountain bikes, and he hadn't been making mountain bikes for quite a while. He's gone on to making motocross. They're very big in the motocross world, around the world. But he just liked the challenge, so he put this first bike together, which I trialled up in Spitsbergen. And the only thing wrong with it, the main thing wrong with it, was it only could take 4-inch wide tyres, not 5-inch wide tyres. The flotation wasn't good enough. But the bike itself, it was a pretty good concept, and it's amazing, like incredibly efficient. It's virtually no difference between riding that and a normal bike. Like it's incredible how it works. That the drive kind of causes a lift at the same time, and it tends to grip. So it doesn't make you go any faster, but because you're riding on soft and uneven surfaces, when you don't know when you're going to go down sometimes, it just adds a bit more grip. So you tend to spend a little bit less energy staying upright than you would on a normal bike. And there are certain times when a normal bike wouldn't have done what I did. But it's no miracle. Like it's not like it makes it massively easier. It's still unbelievably hard work. A bit harder than cycling on sand in general, as far as I can see.
What, on the snow?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just because the surfaces can be more softer, a bit softer, and plus the extreme cold, for me, that's much harder than the extreme heat because I'm good at the heat. So the skill of getting used to exercising in the extreme cold and not perspiring and getting the layering systems right, and probably cycling in these conditions is probably just about as hard as you can do, because it's not as efficient as skiing. You can't just suddenly slow down because you just stop and fall off. So skiers, if they start to perspire, can often just reduce the intensity and keep moving forwards. But I can't do that on a bike. So the issues I have are just trying to really control my body moisture, because obviously when you stop, that freezes and I get really cold. So that was all learning Spitsbergen. And then it's been 3 years since that because it's a very expensive game and I'm trying very hard to find the funding for Antarctica. Thought Africa was hard to find the funding. Well, this is much more expensive. But I did last Christmas finally have enough money to do the second trial up in Greenland. And myself and Claudio went up to, it's in northeast Greenland, so no bike's ever been up in northeast Greenland before. So it's about just over 70 odd degrees north above a place. If you look on a map of East Greenland, you see there's a massive fjord called Scoresby Sund, which is the world's largest fjord, and we were just above that in Liverpool Land and Jameson Land. And there's a little tiny airport that you can fly into, and there's the most northerly habitable town in Greenland is there as well, called Ittoqqortoormiut. I can say that now. And so Claudia and I flew in there, and there's a British company called Tangent Expeditions, and I've been working with them, and they organised all the logistics. So this was another trial. In the end, I didn't do all that I wanted to do in terms of the distance. I wanted it to be an extended 3-week trip. But unfortunately, the conditions were sort of unseasonably warm. And because of that, there were blizzards. So we lost 8 days at the start just because of the blizzards. It was coming and then we couldn't go out in it. So that was a bit annoying. And then at the end, there was just too much melting. So in fact, I really only had 7 or 8 days out there in terms of on expedition, but it was still a really good test. And snow conditions would be softer and a bit more sludgy than I would normally get in Antarctica, but it was still, that makes it harder on the bike, actually. Steve Christini made the all-wheel drive Polar Bike Mark II, and this one is sitting in my back room there. Both of them are actually. This can accept a 5-inch wide tyre, so more flotation. But to do that, it's required a much more intricate design, and it's quite incredible what he's done. Rather than having a straight line from the rear hub to the head tube, he's had to, because that would just make it too wide to cycle around, and the angles were all wrong, he had to add in a universal joint in the middle, and he's still got it right. It's ridiculous. So that was what I was trialling, and it's a beautiful bike, actually. It's got some really nice rims and hubs and all sorts of things on there. And technology has improved, in fact, for fat bikes in the last 3 years. So the benefit of that too. So that was wild.
What about storage? Do you have sort of bags or something that you can attach either to the bike, or do you wear like a backpack or, to store gear in?
Never wear a backpack. I don't need to add any extra stress to my back. And secondly, even with the best designs, there's still going to perspire between the clothing and my back and pack. So don't wear a backpack. These are supported expeditions, so I don't have to carry too much. However, I have to carry safety equipment. I also really want to find a system to carry my down clothing, because if we're separated for any reason and we stop, I need to stay warm. And so I've kind of fiddled around with, I took sort of a little, what's called a sweet roll. So it was like a stuff sack that attaches to the front handlebars. And I thought that would be a great thing to be able to stuff my sort of warm clothes in when I got warm, cycling, because you get pretty hot cycling. But unfortunately, the wind resistance, I was going straight into an Arctic gale there, and it was too much. So I got rid of that. But I used this little, they're called little mountain feeder bags. They're just little bags that hook into between the stem and the handlebars, and I can put sort of drinks like a little thermos and food, those kind of things in there, and then the rest I just stuff in my pockets. That's all I need. For these expeditions, at the moment for the trials. In Antarctica, I still will fiddle with the idea of maybe a bag under the seat this time. Nothing like, no normal racks or anything would fit with the design that I've got on the bike. But you can get lots of great sort of soft bags, handlebar bags, seat bags, and so on that would suffice. So a company called Revelate an Alaskan company sort of sponsoring me on that one. And the one thing that they make that is awesome is expedition pogies, so handlebar mitts, really ultra warm handlebar mitts that fit over the front handlebars to keep my hands warm, because that's a real issue, keeping hands and feet warm. So that's a real plus. And those handlebar mitts also can carry bits of food and all sorts of things in those pouches, like a kangaroo pouch, just put it in there nice and warm.
Just on nutrition, are you going to have some sort of nutritional plan leading up to the Antarctic expedition? Are you going to maybe go on like a high-fat diet, or are you going to sort of adjust your nutrition leading up to this expedition at all?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because for Greenland and for Spitsbergen, I hadn't adjusted anything because it's just too hard to put all those things together at the time. I do have a nutritionist, a dietitian that I can consult, and she's really up for helping me out. You're dead right that I need to change the composition of my diet just beforehand to higher fat, which is, butter's the best form of energy that keeps you warm in those conditions, apparently, according to Eric Phillips. And Eric is still advising me on everything, so I can ask him about anything, including diet, and he's the master. He's walked to the North and South Poles and guides people every year. So I'm probably looking for, I've got some ideas, quite a lot of ideas, but at the moment I'm mostly focused on finding the funds, but because that's taking everything that I have at the moment, all my sleep as well. But certainly leading up to that last 7 weeks will be quite important to, as you say, to just start tweaking the diet to more what I'm used to, so it's not too much shock. The poor old liver having to deal with all that fat and so on.
So this expedition you're sort of targeted for November, December this year, 2016, and sort of January next year.
Yeah.
There's I think you can, come through with the goods, with getting the sponsorship and all that. That'll be that's going to be an awesome expedition.
Oh, finding the sponsorship is just the hardest thing, and if I get to the start point, I know pretty much that I'm really well prepared to get to the end point, and I've got the best team that I can possibly have around me. We can, with Claudio on side. If you go to my website and have a look at some of the videos he's already created, it's we know we can create great products for whoever, and we've got a lot of interest. We've got Nat Geo people interested in, and we're negotiating with them now. But the hugest issue for me is that this expedition, the logistics, which is essentially $500,000, has to be paid 90 days in advance, and that's my problem right now. So it's a supported expedition because we want to be able to really keep the communications going well, and I'm not in a position where I can carry all of my equipment on the bike. It's hard enough without carrying the equipment on the bike in these conditions. So I'm right on my limit as it is. So I know myself. Only one person carried everything to the South Pole before, and essentially he did a great job, but he carried skis with him, and every time he couldn't cycle, he skied. And he skied actually most of the way and cycled about 100 and something or 200 kilometres out of 1,100. So that, and he's a really strong, fit guy. So it's a great effort, but, I'm trying to cycle, and I know that I just can't carry a full pack.
So I've noticed with these expeditions, there's a bit of a theme. You've done, early days you did Europe, you've done Australia, you've done sort of, Russia/Asia, you've done Africa, coming up is Antarctica.
Yeah.
Are you sort of working your way along all the continents, North America, South America down the track maybe?
Hopefully by the end of my life I will have done all of that. Yeah. It's kind of, I don't just cross the country or whatever, or continent just for the sake of it, but at the same, I put a lot of effort into how to tell a story and a unique story. So I'm not just one to the next go from the tip of Alaska down to the tip of Terra del Fuego on its own, but I certainly have a desire to do something interesting on both those continents. The Arctic Circle is looking very interesting to me in general, which would include North America. But these, let me get through Antarctica first, because every time, like, I have these great ideas, but then each of these expeditions changed me a little bit and opened my eyes as to what can really be done. And so there are other things that I want to do also that are less enormous in terms of, or demanding as well. And right now I'm setting up my own foundation, the Breaking the Cycle Foundation, which is matching education for leadership, which is a real passion of mine, the importance of educating the next generation, with also initially supporting some of the issues I learned so much about in Africa, some of the community-led initiatives I'd really like to help further, and I'm putting those two things together. I'm a Scout ambassador now as well, so we're sort of working on a couple of things there. But it doesn't have to be Africa in the future only, so I want to sort of use Antarctica to raise funds for this new foundation, of which we can really make a difference to the next generation and help some of those who really need it. So that's kind of where I'm aiming, and exploring other parts of the world is certainly on my agenda. I have a huge bucket list, but I don't like there's some really interesting ones that I plan to do that are shorter. I'm going to do some more little bits and pieces with the world expeditions, but they're not real expeditions, but they're just interesting trips to do and to share time with other people. So it's getting to be a nice balance. It's hard to make a living out of these things, and I don't just make a living out of these things. I have to do other stuff as well. So yeah,
that's excellent. Now, just before you go, you're an endurance cyclist. You've also done real tennis. Can you maybe just give us a quick rundown on that? What is real tennis? And you've actually won 5 Australian Open singles titles and 6 doubles titles in real tennis.
That's right.
Yeah, what is that?
So real tennis is the original game of tennis. In fact, its correct name is tennis, and the game that you just watched on Wimbledon is called lawn tennis. It doesn't have to be played on grass to be called lawn tennis. However, so this is really the origin of tennis. It's where it comes from. It's a 900-year-old game, which hasn't changed much for about the last 550 years. So initially people started playing on the streets in Central Europe and specifically in France, and they started playing with their hands, and they would have started with a cloth ball hitting over a barrier on a street, and then gradually that evolved, and it evolved a lot in monasteries, in the courtyards of monasteries. And if you look at the architecture of a real tennis court today, it looks like it could be either a street with shop awnings down the side, or it could be the courtyard of a monastery. The court itself the game itself is like a mix between tennis, squash, and chess. It's played indoors on a larger court than a tennis court. It's about 5 meters longer and wider and has walls. And you hit the ball over a net. And the net's about 3 feet high in the middle and 5 feet at the side, so it looks a bit saggy. And so, yeah, it's kind of this game that it's quite an intellectual game, hence the chess side of things. But at a top level, it's physically pretty tough. The floor is made of concrete. You're changing directions. It can be very fast, but it can also be played at a lot of different levels. You play with a racket, which is the same length as a tennis racket that you know, but actually it has to be made of wood, and the head's much smaller, and it's much stronger. The strings are much more tightly strung, about twice as tight as a lawn tennis racket. In fact, a machine can't even string it tight enough. You have to do it by hand. It's one of my jobs. The ball is more like a cricket ball or a baseball, but looks like a tennis ball. So it's very, very hard. And again, we have to, as professionals, make these balls by hand. Okay. It takes a lot of spin. And so it's kind of this game, even though it's called tennis or real tennis, it's kind of, you can't just have played the other game and come and play tennis. It's like if you played squash, it helps. If you played tennis, it helps. If you played cricket, it helps, or hockey. They all help, but it's a new game. And after my Russian expedition, I ended up working at a place in London that had a court. And I picked, having been a good squash player and tennis player and other things, I picked it up. And 2 years later, became a pro. I just sort of fell in love with the challenge of it as well, similar to my cycling. And then after that, so I also work in real tennis, and I'm just working casually or part-time at the moment. But I've been to world number 2. I've been around there here and there, but I've always also had to manage a really bad knee injury that I incurred just as I became a pro. So that's something that I had to deal with for everything that I do. I've had 8 operations, 2 cartilage grafts. I've had everything, even last year, my own stem cells injected into it, but it didn't really help much. So the cycling is actually not bad for it. Like I've just been up to Ladakh in India and done, these 5,000 meter passes, and actually over the week, my body gets better. Sitting around makes it worse. A real tennis makes my knee worse because of the changing directions and the violent nature of the movements in the game. And but so I just have to just work the best I can to manage it. And so I haven't really been competing too much in the last few years. I've just been holding off and playing the odd set, but that's about it. The rest is just coaching because I'm trying to manage my need for longevity. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And whereabouts can people find you online and, follow the next adventure, Breaking the Cycle South Pole, and support you and follow your progress? Whereabouts can people find you?
Yeah, so people can go to my website, which is pretty easy to remember. It's just kateleeming.com. For Breaking the Cycle South Pole, we'll eventually have a new website specifically for that, but kateleeming.com is a good start. You can pick me up on Facebook or Twitter from there. I'm going to be running a crowdfunding campaign in the next few weeks, just getting it up and running. So I'd love people's support for that as well. And if anyone has any idea about more connections with sponsors, I need, please share. Yep. That's pretty much it. There's a lot of information on my website, and if you just need to contact me, just press contact there, and I'll receive your email.
No, that's excellent. Yeah. Good luck with the journey leading up to the next expedition, and I'll definitely be following your progress and how it all pans out. And thanks again for coming on to the podcast.
Thanks, Matt. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Okay.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
You've just been listening to the Born to Kick-Ass podcast at borntokickass.com. If you liked what you heard and want more, please subscribe on iTunes. Give a 5-star rating and a kick-ass review. This really helps to boost our presence and continues to allow us to introduce you to the most fascinating people on the planet. Welcome aboard, and catch you next time.